The men moved in silence, one after another, a long line cutting through the suffocating green. The jungle in Vietnam was not just terrain, it was an enemy of its own. Visibility was often reduced to a few meters. Thick vegetation swallowed sound, distorted distance, and concealed movement. In a war where sight meant survival, American forces suddenly found themselves nearly blind. By 1967, U.S. Marines operating in places like Quang Tri Province were facing a problem they hadn't fully anticipated. Traditional battlefield tactics, developed for open terrain in Europe and Korea, were failing. There were no clear front lines, no easily identifiable enemy positions. Instead, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army fighters blended seamlessly into the environment, using it as both shield and weapon. They knew every trail, every hidden path, every natural ambush point. For American troops, this created a constant sense of uncertainty. Patrols could move for hours without seeing anything, only to be suddenly hit by accurate fire from an unseen enemy. The jungle absorbed muzzle flashes, masked movement, and made it almost impossible to determine where shots were coming from. A single hidden marksman could stall an entire unit. The standard-issue rifle for many U.S. forces at the time was the M14, a lightweight, high-rate-of-fire weapon designed for close-quarters engagements. It performed well in rapid firefights, but it wasn't built for precision at long distances, especially not in an environment where targets were fleeting and often partially obscured. Even the older M14 rifle, which had better range and stopping power, was not initially deployed as a dedicated sniper weapon. It lacked specialized optics and consistent accuracy in its standard configuration. This created a dangerous gap. Marines needed the ability to identify and eliminate threats before those threats could strike. They needed precision, they needed reach, but more than anything, they needed eyes in a place where vision was constantly denied. The enemy, on the other hand, had already adapted. Viet Cong fighters frequently used bolt-action rifles or carefully aimed shots from concealed positions. They understood patience, they understood terrain, and they understood that in a war like this, the first shot often decided everything. American units began to realize that overwhelming firepower alone wouldn't solve the problem. Spraying bullets into the jungle was ineffective against an enemy you couldn't see. It wasted ammunition, revealed positions, and often achieved nothing. What they needed was the opposite approach: calculated, deliberate, precise. This is where the idea of the modern sniper began to re-emerge within the Marine Corps. Snipers were not a new concept, but after World War II and Korea, their role had diminished in emphasis. Now, in Vietnam, the conditions made their value undeniable. A single skilled marksman, properly equipped, could observe enemy movement, gather intelligence, and eliminate high-value targets without exposing an entire unit. But there was a problem. The Marines didn't yet have the proper tools for the job. Early attempts at creating sniper capability were improvised. Some Marines took standard rifles and modified them in the field. Scopes were added when available, often without proper mounting systems. Weapons varied in accuracy, reliability, and performance. There was no standardized sniper rifle program at the beginning of the conflict, and no consistent doctrine guiding how snipers should operate in this new kind of war. Despite this, a small number of Marines began to experiment. They worked with what they had. They adjusted their rifles, learned to read the jungle, and trained themselves to move slower, quieter, and more deliberately than conventional infantry. These early snipers operated in pairs, shooter and spotter, developing techniques that would later become standard practice. They learned how heat affected bullet trajectory in humid air. They studied how light filtered through dense foliage, creating illusions and false shadows. They practiced remaining motionless for hours, sometimes days, waiting for a single opportunity. Every shot had to count, because in the jungle, a missed shot didn't just mean failure, it meant giving away your position. The lack of proper equipment forced innovation. Marines began searching for ways to improve accuracy, stability, and concealment. They experimented with different optics, different ammunition, and different firing positions. Some even crafted makeshift ghillie suits from local vegetation, blending into the environment so completely that they became nearly invisible. What started as a necessity quickly turned into a quiet evolution. These men were no longer just riflemen, they were becoming something else entirely. Observers, hunters, specialists in a war where seeing without being seen was the ultimate advantage. And slowly, almost unnoticed at first, the balance began to shift. The same jungle that once blinded American forces was starting to reveal its secrets to those patient enough to learn its language. But the real breakthrough, the moment when improvisation turned into something far more effective, was still ahead.
At first, it didn't look like a solution at all. It wasn't a new weapon shipment or a revolutionary design. There was no official announcement, no sudden change in doctrine. What emerged instead was something far more unexpected, an adaptation born out of necessity, built from what was already available. The rifle was the M14. By the mid-1960s, the M14 was already being phased out in favor of the lighter, more modern M16. The military viewed it as outdated for the evolving needs of infantry combat. It was heavier, harder to control in automatic fire, and less suited for the rapid, close-range engagements common in Vietnam. But what many overlooked was the one thing the M14 still did exceptionally well. It could hit distant targets with power and consistency. Some Marines began to notice this. In a war where visibility was limited but danger could come from hundreds of meters away, the M14 offered something rare: reach. Its 7.62 by 51 millimeter round carried farther, hit harder, and maintained accuracy better than the smaller 5.56 millimeter rounds fired by the M16. It wasn't perfect, but it had potential. The real breakthrough came not from a factory, but from the field. Marines started modifying their M14s in small, practical ways. They weren't building precision rifles in a controlled environment. They were making adjustments in jungle conditions, often with limited tools and resources. Scopes were mounted onto rifles that were never originally designed to carry them. Sometimes the mounts were unstable, sometimes the optics were mismatched, but it was a start. One of the simplest yet most effective changes involved stabilizing the rifle. Small tweaks, tightening components, adjusting stocks, improving bedding, helped reduce movement and increase consistency. These weren't expensive upgrades. In fact, some of the fixes were so minor that Marines joked they cost almost nothing. That's where the idea of the 75-cent solution began to take shape. Not a literal price tag in every case, but a reflection of how such a small investment could produce such a dramatic improvement. It wasn't just about the rifle itself. Ammunition selection became critical. Marines began choosing rounds more carefully, looking for consistency in performance. They paid attention to how each shot behaved, learning to predict bullet drop and drift over longer distances. This level of attention was new for many infantrymen, but it quickly became essential. Compared to purpose-built sniper rifles used in earlier wars, these modified M14s were far from perfect. They lacked uniformity. No two rifles were exactly the same. Some performed better than others, depending on how they were tuned and who was using them. But in the hands of a skilled Marine, even an imperfect rifle could become a precise instrument. What made this transformation remarkable was how unofficial it was. There was no immediate large-scale program supporting it. These changes spread through observation and word of mouth. One Marine would see another make a long-distance shot that seemed impossible, then ask how it was done. Techniques were shared quietly, refined over time, and passed along to others. The jungle, once a place of confusion, began to feel slightly more predictable for those carrying these modified rifles. Marines started engaging targets at distances that had previously been considered unrealistic in that environment. Shots beyond 500 meters, once rare, became achievable under the right conditions. And then came the stories, accounts of even longer shots, distances that sounded exaggerated, almost mythical. At the center of it all was a simple idea. Precision didn't always require perfection, it required understanding. Marines learned how to work with the limitations of their rifles instead of fighting against them. They adjusted their expectations, their positioning, and their timing. They didn't rely on rapid fire, they relied on the first shot. Everything depended on that single moment. Breathing steady, sight aligned, trigger squeezed with absolute control. The optics themselves were basic by modern standards. Early scopes provided magnification, but they weren't always rugged enough for the harsh jungle environment. Moisture, heat, and rough handling could throw them off. Marines had to constantly check and recheck their equipment, making sure it would perform when needed. There was no margin for error. Despite these challenges, something important was happening. The M14 was no longer just a standard-issue rifle. It was becoming a platform for precision, not through advanced engineering, but through adaptation, patience, and necessity. And as more Marines began to adopt these modified rifles, the role of the sniper started to solidify. This was no longer an improvised solution, it was evolving into a deliberate strategy. Units began to recognize the value of having designated marksmen who could operate independently, observe enemy movement, and strike with accuracy at distance. The 75-cent idea symbolized more than just a cheap modification. It represented a shift in mindset. Instead of waiting for the perfect tool, Marines created one from what they already had. They turned limitation into advantage. What started as an experiment was becoming something far more dangerous for the enemy, because now the Americans were no longer just reacting. They were watching, waiting, and choosing exactly when to strike. And soon, the men behind these rifles would prove just how far that precision could go.
By the time the modified rifles began to prove their worth, it became clear that the weapon alone was not enough. Precision shooting in Vietnam demanded something far greater than equipment. It required a different kind of Marine. Not faster, not stronger, but more patient. The men who stepped into this role quickly realized they were no longer fighting the war the same way as everyone else. While infantry units moved in groups, covering ground and reacting to contact, snipers operated on a completely different level. They slowed everything down. Every movement, every breath, every decision had to be deliberate. Training at first was far from formal. There was no unified sniper school early in the war. Instead, knowledge was passed from one Marine to another, built on experience rather than structured doctrine. Those who showed natural skill with a rifle were often selected or volunteered themselves. From there, they learned by doing, by observing, by failing, and by adapting. One of the first lessons was simple but difficult to master: remain unseen. In the jungles of Vietnam, this was an art form. The environment was alive, constantly shifting with wind, light, and sound. A sniper had to become part of it. Movement was the greatest enemy. Even the slightest unnatural motion could give away a position. So they learned to move slowly, sometimes taking hours to cover just a few meters. Every step was placed carefully, avoiding dry leaves, snapping twigs, or anything that might create noise. Camouflage became more than just wearing the right uniform. Marines began crafting their own ghillie suits, using pieces of fabric, netting, and local vegetation. Leaves, branches, and grass were woven into their gear until their outline disappeared completely. At a distance, they no longer looked like men, they looked like part of the jungle itself. But blending in visually was only part of the challenge. Sound discipline was just as critical. Equipment had to be secured so nothing rattled. Even breathing had to be controlled during critical moments. In the stillness of the jungle, small sounds could travel far. Snipers typically worked in pairs, a shooter and a spotter. This partnership was essential. The shooter focused on the shot itself, steady aim, controlled trigger pull, perfect timing. The spotter, meanwhile, observed everything else. He scanned for movement, calculated distance, accounted for wind, and watched for threats. He also confirmed hits and guided adjustments if a second shot was needed. Trust between the two had to be absolute. They often spent long hours, sometimes days, in the same concealed position, waiting, watching, enduring heat, insects, and exhaustion. There were moments when nothing happened at all, when the jungle seemed empty and silent. But that silence could break instantly, and when it did, there was no time to hesitate. Mental discipline became the defining trait. Anyone could pull a trigger, but not everyone could wait for the right moment. Snipers had to resist the urge to take low-probability shots. A missed shot didn't just alert the enemy, it could compromise the entire mission. Patience was not optional, it was survival. They also had to learn how to read the environment in ways most soldiers never considered. Light filtered unevenly through the canopy, creating shadows that could deceive the eye. Heat and humidity affected bullet trajectory. Even the time of day could change how a target appeared through a scope. These were details that couldn't be ignored at long distances. Tracking the enemy required a different kind of awareness. Snipers studied patterns, how and when enemy fighters moved, where they paused, how they used cover. They learned to anticipate behavior, to predict where someone would be before they even arrived. This turned the sniper from a reactive shooter into a proactive hunter. And then there was the shot itself. In training and in the field, Marines practiced controlling every aspect of it. Breathing was slowed, heart rate managed as much as possible. The trigger was squeezed gently, never pulled abruptly. The goal was to fire without disturbing the rifle's alignment, to let the shot break almost as a surprise. At longer ranges, even small errors became significant. A slight miscalculation in distance or wind could mean a complete miss. That's why communication between shooter and spotter was constant, often reduced to whispers or hand signals. Every variable had to be considered. Over time, these men became something rare on the battlefield. They weren't just soldiers, they were observers, analysts, and executioners combined. They operated on patience instead of speed, precision instead of volume, and their presence began to change the behavior of the enemy. There were reports of enemy fighters becoming more cautious, moving less freely in areas known to have sniper activity. The psychological impact was real. The idea that someone could be watching from an unseen position, waiting for the perfect moment, created tension and uncertainty. It forced the enemy to slow down, to second-guess movements, to hesitate. For the Marines, this was a powerful advantage. What started as an improvised role was becoming a defining element of the battlefield. The rifles had been adapted, the techniques refined, but it was the men behind the scopes who truly made the difference. And soon, their skills would be tested at distances that pushed the limits of what anyone thought possible.
At first, the distances didn't seem real. In the jungle, most firefights happened at close range, sometimes so close that targets appeared and disappeared in seconds. Visibility rarely allowed for anything beyond a few dozen meters, so when reports started coming in about kills at extreme distances, many dismissed them as exaggerations.
Stories passed between units, growing with each retelling. 800 meters, more. Shots that sounded more like myth than reality. But for the men behind the scopes, these were not stories. They were moments, rare, difficult, and unforgiving. Taking a shot at that kind of range in Vietnam was nothing like shooting on an open field. The jungle distorted everything. Light bent through layers of leaves, shadows shifted constantly, and the air itself seemed heavy. Heat and humidity affected how a bullet traveled, slowing it, pushing it off course in subtle ways. Even identifying a target at that distance was a challenge. The process began long before the trigger was touched. A sniper team would spend hours observing a single area. They studied movement patterns, watched trails, and waited for confirmation. A target had to be clearly identified. No guesswork, no rushed decisions. At long range, the margin for error was too small. One mistake could cost the opportunity entirely. Distance estimation was critical. Without modern laser rangefinders, Marines relied on experience, optics, and visual judgment. They compared the size of a target against known references, used scope markings, and made calculated assumptions. It wasn't perfect, but with practice, it became surprisingly accurate. Then came the variables. Wind was one of the most unpredictable factors. Even a light crosswind could push a bullet off target over hundreds of meters. In the jungle, wind didn't move in a straight, consistent line. It shifted, bounced, and changed direction as it passed through trees and terrain. Snipers had to read subtle signs, the movement of leaves, the sway of grass, even the feel of air on their skin. Gravity, of course, never changed. Over long distances, the bullet would drop significantly. Marines had to compensate by aiming above the target, often relying on memorized adjustments rather than precise calculations. It was a blend of instinct and learned behavior. And then there was the rifle itself. The modified M14, while powerful and reliable, was not designed for this level of precision. Every rifle behaved slightly differently. Each one had its own quirks, its own patterns. Snipers had to know their weapon intimately, how it reacted, how it grouped shots, how it performed under different conditions. There was no room for uncertainty. When everything aligned, the position, the distance, the wind, and the target, the moment finally came. Breathing slowed. The world narrowed to a single point. The trigger was squeezed gently, carefully, until the shot broke. At that distance, the result wasn't immediate. There was a delay, a fraction of a second that felt much longer. The bullet traveled, cutting through layers of air, carrying every calculation with it. And then, if everything had been done correctly, the impact followed. Confirmed kills at ranges approaching 800 meters began to surface. Not often, not easily, but enough to be undeniable. These were not lucky shots. They were the result of skill, patience, and a deep understanding of both weapon and environment. To those who hadn't witnessed it, the idea still sounded impossible. How could someone hit a target that far away, in a jungle where you could barely see? But the answer lay in the discipline of the sniper teams. They didn't rely on chance. They created the conditions where such a shot could succeed. Eyewitness accounts from spotters played a crucial role in confirming these engagements. The spotter observed the entire sequence, tracking the target, watching the shot, and verifying the result. Without that confirmation, many of these stories might have remained dismissed as rumor. For the enemy, the effect was profound. The knowledge that someone could reach out from such a distance, from an unseen position, changed behavior. Movement became more cautious. Open areas, once considered relatively safe, turned into zones of risk. Even well-concealed fighters could no longer assume they were beyond reach.
Snipers began to shape the battlefield in ways that extended far beyond the number of shots they fired. A single confirmed long-range kill could disrupt an entire area, forcing the enemy to reconsider how and where they operated. But these moments came at a cost. Extreme range shooting demanded time, focus, and exposure. A sniper team often had only one chance before their position was compromised. After a shot, especially at long distance, there was always the risk that the enemy would trace the origin or begin searching the area. Extraction had to be planned as carefully as the shot itself. Not every attempt succeeded. There were misses, shots that fell short, drifted wide, or were thrown off by unseen factors. Each miss was a lesson, a reminder of just how difficult these engagements were. But with each attempt, experience grew. Over time, what once seemed impossible became achievable, though never easy. The idea of the 820-meter kill stopped being dismissed and started being respected. It represented the outer edge of what these Marines could do under some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. It wasn't just about distance, it was about control in a place defined by chaos. And as these shots became part of the reality of the war, one thing became clear. The jungle no longer belonged to those who hid within it. Now, it also belonged to those who could see through it.
By the later years of the war, it was no longer a question of whether snipers were effective. That answer had already been proven in the field, one carefully placed shot at a time. What began as improvisation, modified rifles, borrowed optics, self-taught techniques, had grown into something far more structured. The Marine Corps started to recognize that this was not just a temporary solution to a jungle problem. It was a capability that needed to be refined, expanded, and preserved. The lessons learned in Vietnam didn't stay in Vietnam. What those sniper teams developed under pressure began to shape how the military thought about precision shooting as a whole. It was no longer just about having a good marksman in a unit. It was about building a system, training, equipment, doctrine, all working together to create consistent, repeatable results. One of the first changes came in training. The informal, experience-based learning that defined the early years started to evolve into structured programs. The Marine Corps established dedicated sniper training, focusing not just on shooting, but on fieldcraft, observation, and mental discipline. Future snipers would no longer have to figure everything out on their own. They would be taught from the beginning how to move, how to hide, how to think. The role itself became more clearly defined. Snipers were no longer seen as simply support elements, they were force multipliers. A well-positioned sniper team could influence an entire area, gather intelligence, and disrupt enemy operations without ever engaging in a traditional firefight. Their value extended far beyond the number of targets they engaged. Equipment followed the same path of evolution. The limitations of the modified rifles used in Vietnam highlighted the need for purpose-built sniper systems. Weapons designed specifically for accuracy, stability, and consistency began to replace the improvised setups of the past. Optics improved as well, becoming more reliable, more precise, and better suited for a range of environments. But even as new rifles entered service, the legacy of the M14 remained. It had proven that precision didn't always require perfection. It showed that with the right understanding and discipline, even a standard rifle could be transformed into something far more capable. In some cases, upgraded versions of the M14 continued to serve in designated marksman roles for decades, a testament to its enduring effectiveness. The influence of these Vietnam-era snipers could also be seen in how modern units approached combat. The emphasis on observation, patience, and selective engagement became more deeply integrated into military thinking. Technology would continue to advance, but the core principles remained the same. A sniper's greatest asset was not the rifle, it was the ability to remain unseen, to understand the environment, and to act at exactly the right moment. There was also a lasting psychological dimension to their work. The presence of snipers changed how the enemy behaved, and that lesson carried forward into future conflicts. Precision fire created uncertainty. It forced caution. It slowed movement and disrupted plans. In many ways, the psychological impact of a sniper was just as important as the physical effect. For the men who served in that role, the experience left a mark that went beyond the battlefield. Long hours of isolation, the constant pressure of making a single shot count, and the knowledge of what that shot meant, these were things that stayed with them. Their contribution was often quiet, rarely visible to those outside their units, but deeply felt by those who understood the role. As the war came to an end, the stories remained. Stories of patience measured in hours and days. Stories of shots taken at distances few believed possible. Stories of adaptation, where necessity forced innovation, and innovation led to transformation. The 75-cent solution became more than just a phrase. It became a symbol of a mindset, the idea that effectiveness doesn't always come from having the most advanced tools, but from knowing how to use what you have better than anyone else. In the years that followed, sniper programs would become more advanced, more standardized, and more technologically supported. But at their core, they still carried the imprint of what was learned in Vietnam. A war that once took away visibility, in an unexpected way, created some of the most perceptive and disciplined marksmen in modern military history. And long after the jungle fell silent, the legacy of those Marines remained. Quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore.